Um, Welcome to the Townsend Center. We're nearing the end of the semester, thankfully, so I can be brief at the points. Feel like goes without saying. So we're pleased to host Shannon Steen, professor in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, and our associate dean for programs and planning in LNS. Today, Shannon will be joined by David Henkin for a discussion of her recent book, The Creativity Complex, Art, Tech, and the Seduction of an Idea. I have only one forthcoming event to announce, the Townsend Center's final public event of the season. Next Wednesday, April 24th, the New Yorker staff writer Adam Gopnik will deliver the talk, The National Emergency on Liberal Institutions, Protecting Pluralism and Free Debate. These are topics roiling university campuses, ours included, and Gopnik's talk is part of work he's doing for the New Yorker on the necessity of free debate and today's unique threats to the institution of liberal democracy that institutions of liberal democracy that protect it. The Townsend Center was pleased to collaborate with Humanities West San Francisco, and we thank them for their generosity in making Gopnik's visit possible. The talk will take place in this room, the Gabal Room, at 12 noon, like I said, on Wednesday, April 24th. Shannon and David, we're really delighted to have you close out our book chat series for this academic year. So thank you. I'll hand the mic figuratively over to you.
Oh, I figuratively accept and please welcome. Okay, so it's a huge pleasure for me to not only to get to talk with Shannon about this fabulous book, not only because Shannon and I go back a long way, and we've taught together, and many of the issues that animate this book are issues I've learned a lot about from Shannon over the years, but also because this is a topic that I think cuts close, and you would use the word cut advisedly, cuts close to the bone for many of us in this university, in this part of the world as well. So I'll share a short anecdote. I must have been 20 years ago. I was on some panel in San Francisco, completely unrelated to my work in the university, but the topic was about building alternative intentional communities. I don't exactly remember what it was, but someone raised their hand, and apropos of some remark about some new communities being built in San Francisco, made the suggestion that it was like no coincidence because San Francisco is this place of innovation, and he drew some parallel between,
prop problems.
All right, sorry. I'm just gonna hold this so that's okay. He drew some parallel between. He did it without using the word disrupt. He drew some parallel between innovative community building and, I don't know, the beat poetry, and implicitly, Google, to suggest that this is what San Francisco was always about. It was always about, and I regarded this suggestion as sort of like inane, and also incredibly naive, that this is what this person thought the history of San Francisco was like. This person thought there was any connection between these three things. Now, looking back on it, I guess I still think it's inane, but it's not naive at all. It seems actually a little insidious. It's despite its banality, it seems like taken for granted, and it seems to have a certain kind of plausibility as a description of a kind of intellectual culture in the Bay Area, at least as it's perceived by certain sectors within the Bay Area and more broadly by places like the New York Times. So to account for how we've gotten to the point where that sort of inanity can strike us as threatening requires a book like this. And one of the things the book puts at the center is the word creativity. So I thought, Shannon, I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that word. I mean, especially maybe that if we can do a little keyword thing here, that word in relationship to some of the other words with which it's paired. Innovation is the big one now, but genius historically, originality, even artisanality, a word that you sort of probe here. So tell us about the word creativity, either historically or conceptually. What do you think it does very specifically in relationship to some of those other, or in conjunction with some of those other concepts?
There's the sort of semantic mapping of it, and then there are the sort of knock-on effects of that and the way that those concepts have been used to think about the social and the political world in particular ways. So I think you're right that some of the terms that are often seen as analogs or that certainly are constellated with it are things like genius and artisanship and all of these other things. I think individualism is a term that gets caught up in it in all kinds of complicated ways. One of the things that's sort of interesting about the shift in the way we've been talking about it that I think is probably more obvious at this point than it was even a decade ago is the shift from thinking about creativity as this form of kind of heightened cognitive capacity that at least at one point when it was first becoming a kind of cultural keyword in the early 19th century was really associated most closely with the world of the arts and the work of the artist. And then at some point became more closely associated with economic capacity. And so one of the things that I was trying to do in the book was to think about, okay, so how did we get from A to B? And what have been some of the effects of that shift, both within the arts, but also for the world more broadly? One of the sort of like key places where I think that has happened are in the world of psychology research, which is really where there's this kind of intensified thing that happens after the Second World War, where creativity becomes identified as one of the central research topics of psychology researchers, largely for reasons associated with the Cold War, where it's seen both as the capacity that's really key for Americans to inculcate in school children, both for its ability to kind of serve as a bulwark against totalitarianism, but also as a way to beat the Soviets, in effect, in the technology race that was a major part of the Cold War. And at that point, the arts, where it had been sort of like seen as the kind of primary domain of creativity before that, becomes kind of sidelined as this kind of symbolic handmaiden to that other sort of more technocratic kind of sense of what it can be. What gets really interesting at that point is a way that then it moves into all of these other domains that we think of as being really different from the arts, but that then become kind of like weirdly, tentacularly networked into it. So it becomes associated with military research. The military actually fund a big part of the Cold War research that happens in the world of psychology. It moves into places like electoral politics. So one of the chapters that I talk about is what happens when Ronald Reagan runs for governor of California in the 60s, which he does very much as an outsider candidate, right? Like he's the underdog candidate, even within the Republican Party, and is successful as a candidate, both within the Republican Party and more broadly in California, because he runs under this campaign theme of the creative society, where he really basically uses the kind of Cold War reconceptualization of that term as a challenge to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And the idea of a kind of new, a kind of liberal order that is based on some kind of civil rights organization or a post-New Deal kind of economic policies and things like that. And then moves into things like real estate and education and all kinds of stuff.
Can you talk us through that a little bit? Because I mean, that's one of the striking things. The Cold War story that you just outlined, I think it's probably familiar to many people in this room. What's striking is what really happens in the last third of the 20th century, and in many ways intensifies at the end of the Cold War. So in a way, you know, I read this book and I see the Reagan chapter as crucial, not for explaining what the Cold War did, but for explaining what was left in the ruins of that war. So what kind of work is the word creative doing for Reagan and in the aftermath? Is this about is this about individual freedom? Is it about, is it a code word for something else? I mean, talk us through what Reagan gets out of that word.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's about kind of reorienting the political world, but also all of the sort of social institutions that he sees as being important to govern differently via a kind of sense of individualism. So actually, his campaign team, when they're thinking about this theme that they're coming up with, one of the things they say is that creativity is another word for man's natural tendency to tend well to his own best interests. And that's the definition of it that they come up with.
Right. So an example of creativity could be, I would like to sell my house only to white people, and that's an expression of creativity. Or I mean, is creativity just a euphemism then, or?
It actually does something that's slightly more triangulated and complex and sneaky on that front. So one of the things that they talk about is how actually we should be using government to just unleash the creative, innovative, problem-solving potential of Californians to solve all of the problems that we have. And we don't need government to do it for us. And in fact, government, when we bring it in, just produces this kind of stultifying bureaucratic effects on all of those institutions. And that really, in order to bust bureaucracy, the thing that we need to do is remove all of the bureaucratic structures that things like a set of civil rights guarantees would enforce. If we can, those structures that are there to guarantee some kind of like civil rights structure are actually impeding our ability to solve all of these problems. And in some ways, that's a very familiar argument that gets made all the time in electoral politics. But Reagan's the person that really encodes that, and then encodes it into a bunch of other institutions like education, actually. So if you think about the things that I think people in this room are probably very familiar with, like the attacks on the UC system or on Berkeley in particular, a lot of the ways that Reagan is actually coding those attacks is by saying, look, we need to actually protect the creative possibility of universities and all of the individualized problem solving that arises out of universities by actually like getting rid of things like campus protest, which is actually deadening the capacity of people to go and solve all of those problems.
Or free tuition.
Or free tuition. Right. That actually, those are things that actually we need to get rid of, because if we do that, then we can actually, enliven people's individual capacity.
So is it your argument that that position, which, as you point out, was familiar in sort of Goldwater or conservative politics, that position wins the day because of the concept of creativity and the way in which it's encoded and then redeployed, or is that just?
I mean, it's not just me that says that. His own campaign managers actually said that. Like his campaign managers, Reagan was one of the first politicians to actually use outside campaign consultants in 1966. And in fact, in some ways, he blueprints that use. And his own campaign manager said, he basically said everything that Goldwater said. He just said it nicer. And this is the sort of container for that nicer structure. It's the camouflage.
Is there also a class element to it? Is the creative class somehow an heir to like the productive class, an attempt to sort of to wrestle the cachet of production and productivity away from working people and toward an entrepreneurial class? Or I mean,
yes, although I think that it does that by playing both sides of that rhetorical coin and trying to conjoin them in some complicated ways. Like if you look at one of the things that happens over the course of the 19th century, creativity becomes a term that splits a kind of labor that is seen as being intellectually transformative from just artisanship, right? So artisanship is something that is associated more with building, with construction, with things like that, and less towards an intellectual transformation. That's the kind of sensibility of it that gets used by people like Richard Florida and the rise of the creative class, right? Like he makes this argument that creative people work with their minds and not with their bodies. The thing that's kind of an interesting then reabsorption of the idea of productivity is that then all of that sense of artisanship becomes kind of re-imported back into the capacity for into creativity's capacity. So if you look at what happens in like educational discourses around creativity, like things that happen in like makers spaces, for example, one of the things that one of the reasons that maker spaces are lauded is for their capacity to actually value craftsmanship, and the artisanal, right? The artisanal as seen as, if not intellectually transformative, certainly as a kind of detailed, impassioned amateurism that nevertheless has this extraordinary value for your capacity to act on the world. And in that sense, it becomes really important in educational discourses around individualism, because it sort of supplants the idea of the transformative capacity of, say, an artist, and revalues instead a kind of personal agential self that is whose primary value is to be able to act on the world without being kind of hampered by working in things like symbolic world making or ethical discernment or things like that. That's all kind of secondary and devalued relative to just agency itself.
Yeah, just on the off chance that there are people who are not familiar, can you tell us a little bit about maker spaces, maker fairs, and things like that? Just so, I mean, maybe this is all like just familiar, but it's just fascinating stuff in the book. So
yeah, so the world, the maker world is one that I think is now very deeply instantiated inside of educational contexts, including in universities, but for sure in the K through 12 world, where it's become, I think, seen as an antidote to both the loss of arts training on the one hand, the loss of vocational training on another hand, in a kind of way to bring in kids who otherwise would have been, who in another day would have been in shop class, but where shop class was basically budget cutted out of the K through 12 system. And also to wed both the kind of artisanship of a shop class and the design capacity of the arts to the tech world. I think that that's kind of been how it's structured in an education context now, but where it kind of comes out of is originally is both the kind of high-tech laboratories of places like MIT and the fabrication labs where you're working with things like 3D printers or microprocessors or laser cutters and things like that, to a kind of sensibility of homesteading, crafting, home amateurism that is really sort of branded by a guy named Dale Doherty, who was one of the people behind AOL. And then launches things like the makers fairs as the kind of branded in-person event for bringing all of those worlds together, and then ends up being sort of like popularized in a way that ends up in K through 12 education. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about what's happened in education is that while it's touted as a kind of solution to the problem of losing arts education, it actually entirely subordinates arts education, right? Like there's
displaces it.
Right, it displaces it, right? That there's no teaching of, how to write poetry or how to compose music or how to paint. Those things are sort of seen as maybe like emotional resources for then a kind of like technological or even technocratic set of skills that are built there instead.
Okay, I want to get back to that later, but there's something I want to point out, which is that many of the things that we've talked about so far in some ways have longer histories. The distinction between manual and non-manual labor seems like an industrial problem. There are echoes and also displacements of Ruskin. There are a lot of things going on that are 19th century. Then you point out in this book, there's a lot of Cold War background to this. And then there are things happen in the 60s and 70s, not just in connection with Reagan, but more generally that animate this. But when you start to talk about the role of tech and makers fairs, readers are probably wondering, well, is that really the historical pivot here? Is it really about the rise of the power of new media and communications technologies and the big, enormous U.S. corporations? Is that really what's really driving the nail in the coffin of the concepts of creativity that you're hoping to rehabilitate or rescue?
I think that the pivot is actually something else, which is trying to talk about how creativity is this term that actually seduces people into feeling comfortable with and even enthusiastic about the kinds of shifts that things like the rise of the tech world and the things like the banality that you talk about and that in your opening anecdote today, feeling not just comfortable about that, but enthusiastic about them. And that, I think the things that are more obvious now than they were a decade ago are the real perils that are produced by that world that I think were less clear at the beginning of social media and things like that, right?
Great. And that gets us, I think, to some of the remarkable texts and cultural productions that you analyze in this book that sort of reflect on that. So I thought I might ask you to talk about, it's only discussed briefly here, but the William Gibson novel, The Peripheral. Do you want to describe what that book, because that seems to fit into that last thing that you said about critical relationship to the perils.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that Gibson is really trying to get us to think about that in that book is the way that creativity has been sort of loaded with this impossible contradiction, which is that on one hand, it's the mechanism for all of this disruptive change and is also supposed to be the solution for it. And that, it feels like, is one of the things that's really interesting. He tells that story via this group of veterans of some unnamed war in the not so distant future who return back to this space where indeed the sort of like economic world that they inhabit has been transformed by making, even though they live in a rural place. So they're not in a city, interestingly, they're actually in a place like West Virginia or something like that. And the only kinds of jobs that are available to them are all based on this kind of like manufacturing structure that comes straight out of ideas about making. You can work for a place called Hefty Mart, which is basically 3D printing on demand consumables like food or clothing or things like that. Or you can work for the Veterans Association, where they are 3D printing things like prostheses for injured veterans. Or you can work for the local narco drug lords who really control all of the local politics by 3D printing either weapons, guns that are used in sort of fights between these different groups, or a drug that's called Wakey. And that group of people end up like surviving in that world partly because they have all this kind of making capacity that they've been taught inside of the military, but also getting then drawn into this kind of like fight of the future that is in some post-apocalyptic world where many fewer human beings exist, that they also survive by effectively by having such acute PTSD that they know how to have an effective enough set of surveillance skills and haptic drone skills that they can like defeat the enemy based on this. So their creative capacity isn't actually the thing that saves them in the end. It's the fact that they have been so precaritized and stressed that they can only live in this highly sort of like surveillance state all the time.
And the dystopia of that, you're arguing, is about maker and creativity culture. It's not just about the set of either, technocratic or geopolitical disasters.
Right. I mean, I think that Gibson is really trying to talk about, he's trying to offer something that's an alternative to just the kind of utopianism around the language of maker culture and the kinds of creativity discourses that it really trades on.
Yeah, so I mean, like lots of that kind of science fiction, it presupposes a set of historical changes that have not yet occurred, but we can imagine. But there are also some big historical changes that have occurred in this book really that's set up not only his book, but also yours. I mean, in a way, there's this thing called deindustrialization, which, as you point out, better understood as the migration of certain industrial capacities from certain regions in the West to other regions and from the West to outside the West. So is that sort of what kind of work is that doing here? I mean, there's a fair amount of interest in your book in the relationship between East Asia and the West, both in terms of the production of goods and also but ideas about what sorts of labor is creative and what sorts of labor is not creative, and also about the relationship between the United States and China. So I'll give you a chance to talk a little bit about that. And I do want to ask you about this remarkable play, Soft Power, that you
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to talk to you about in the last section of the book is the way that the language about creativity is part of ordering geopolitical relationships between especially the US and China. And that China is, I think has been talked about in lots of places as both been maligned in a certain narrative about globalization that sees China as the space for work in that kind of like older industrial sense, but not as a center for creative.
Like creativity is in Cupertino.
Right,
and then,
exactly,
right.
exactly. And that's like explicitly stated by economists and various people, right? So like, you know, Apple is the poster child for globalization because it's imagined in Cupertino, but made in China, right? And China has tried very aggressively to counter that branding in the last like 10 to 15 years. Part of the way that they've done that is actually by incorporating maker spaces, which is like one of the people that I talk about in the book says is really a weird thing because making is something that is a concept that you use to remind people who live in a service economy that there is such a thing as manufacturing. And so it feels really weird to remind people who are in a manufacturing economy that they're doing it, because making in that place is something that you do as a job and not as a form of leisure, which is what it kind of is in the West. One of the things that David Henry Hwang then talks about in this musical soft power is about the sort of like weird sort of rebranding attempts that China, or not weird, the weird ways that the US has responded to China's attempts to sort of rebrand itself that way. So
can you give us the plot really?
Yeah, I'll try to talk it through.
This is remarkable.
So this is the first post-Trump music theater piece. It premieres in 2018, 2019, right there, just before the pandemic is sort of when it really starts to move nationally on tours across the country. But it's David Henry Hwang's piece to sort of like both chart that sense of the problem of thinking about China as the space of work, but not a source of creativity. And to also think about that in light of the problems of democracy inside of the US as we get into the Trump presidency. So he's trying to think, in other words, about both what the sort of geopolitical implications are for thinking about concepts of creativity in different national locations, but also thinking about the ways that that might challenge the way we think about democracy inside the US. So the setup for it is this. He talks about, he basically writes a parody of The King and I, which is a musical that some of you may know is the sort of one of the preeminent Cold War musicals. It's a musical that tries to talk about the creative capacity of soft power, or the creative roots of soft power, that soft power is at its most powerful when it is at its most creative. It stages that by having, you know, this nanny who goes to Thailand and convinces the monarch to be a more democratic, less tyrannical leader by handing all of the women in his harem a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which they then stage as a musical and both convince the sort of like British diplomats that are there and trying to like colonize Thailand that they should just go away because Thailand deserves its own sort of autonomy, but also so infuriates the monarch that he dies, and his son then manumits all of the slaves in the palace. And so Hwang takes this sort of like ludicrous sort of Orientalism behind this musical and turns it on its head by retelling this whole story about Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016, where she has an affair with and falls in love with this Chinese television producer who's basically taking on the role of the nanny in The King and I, and has these long series of conversations with her about how American democracy is really dying and it's not really working very well, at the same time that we see her trying to struggle with the campaign, with just like what the realities are of being on the campaign world. One of the things that the show does sort of over and over and over again is to sort of stress the way that democracy is a bad show, that is basically a form of theatricality that has become really threadbare and worn. But at the same time that that's true, is sort of asking us to think about what we could do to imagine democracy in a different way and elections in a different way that might move us beyond the problems of what happened in 2016.
Before we turn to question and answer, I have to ask maybe the obvious thing, which is you are a scholar of theater history and performance studies, and then in another hat of yours, you are in the business of sort of rethinking higher ed here on this campus. So what does your critical take on the concept of creativity do for either of those enterprises, either for how we ought to think about or teach theater,
Yeah.
or how we ought to think about the role of arts and arts education in relationship to the larger goals of higher ed or the larger political predicaments of higher ed.
So on the art side, one of the things that I've tried really hard in this book is to resist something that I think a lot of people, certainly that are in my field, and might try to make of that history, which is to both try to reclaim creativity as this thing that is really solely for artists, and to see the work of the arts as the antidote to all of these problems, or as the primary antidote. And one of the things that I try to talk about in the book is both the way that, actually, one of the things that has been good about creativity research, I think, is that it really has opened up all of these things that we think that are activities that are really interesting, and valued them as being creative in a way that they hadn't been in those kind of earlier 19th century configurations of it. But the second is to point out that actually the arts are the blueprint for a lot of the problems that have been inaugurated under neoliberalism, which is part of why it's been so effective. That actually it's not a coincidence that the forms of contingent labor that form such a distressingly large number of the new jobs that are entering the economy is called the gig economy, right? Like that comes from the arts, and those structures
And
of
the
labor
performing
actually
arts
come from,
particularly.
and the performing arts in particular. And so really we can't see the arts as the blueprint, as the antidote to these problems, if their structures are the ones that were being used in order to platform
But
them in the first
is
place.
it the artistic notions of creativity from the arts, or is it just the economic predicament of artists that provides the
It's
the
kind
blueprint?
of both, because what's happened is the economic predicament of arts workers has now become the economic predicament of everyone. And that
But are you blaming the arts for that?
No, not at all, not at all. But I think that one of the things that I think I hear often from people in my own field when I talk about this work with them is they keep saying, but if we just brought everybody back to the arts, then all of this would be fine. And I'm trying to say that's not really the case. Like we really, the arts would somehow within itself have to rethink its own sort of labor structures for some of that to happen, which I think is extraordinarily difficult to do, but is really important. The other thing that I think has to happen is to make sure that in the arts, we're articulating the value of what it is that we're doing in ways that don't accidentally end up reaffirming the kind of neoliberal senses of what creativity does. And this is really tricky, right? Because on the one hand, as arts organizations and arts departments face a really genuine economic or financial set of challenges that are extraordinarily difficult for them to overcome, it's been extremely tempting, and I have been tempted many times myself to, in the words of one of my colleagues, ride the creativity train. Right. And so the question is, how do we avoid jumping onto that as a way to reaffirm the value of what it is that we do inside of arts departments, and to instead try to redefine what creativity is in ways that might evade that. And so I talk about that in the epilogue of the book, and sort of try to give some ways that we might need to sort of reconstruct what it is away from those neoliberal sensibilities.
Yeah, I'm tempted to put you on the spot and ask you to offer some shorthand versions of that, but I'm going to not let you do that because I want you all to go out and read and buy the book. All right, so actually, I think why don't we turn this over? I mean, there's lots more to be said about this book, and you'll hopefully have a chance to do so in relation to questions, but I want to make sure that people in the room who might have different curiosities about the project have an opportunity to express them. So who would like to jump in here? Randy.
Interesting to think about this being also a Berkeley set of phenomena, including when the kinds of things you do used to be called interdisciplinary, then they became multidisciplinary, and now they become transdisciplinary, and maybe something else again. And I think of George Lakoff, for example, in linguistics and working on the politics of the rhetoric of politics. And I think of only yesterday receiving a notice from a former student who's a Berkeley PhD who worked on magic in English literature and is now a prime figure in the publication and criticism of climate change rhetoric. Her book is coming out with Oxford Press in June, and she takes up notions like alarmist, like growth, like innovation, like the other watchwords of the anti-climate change people, and including India and China, by the way, and takes them apart. But then in the end, tries to, how do we walk then the talk? And that's the question that David was pointing to toward the end. And one thing about David and me in this room is representations is another sort of Berkeley episode, or Darcy Berkeley episode in this community, is the whole word, that has a kind of presence here and a kind of history here.
Yeah.
Do you see this as a Berkeley project or a Berkeley problem? And do you see Berkeley as particularly well equipped to do the kinds of work that you're imagining, or do you see it as particularly implicated in it?
I think that Berkeley has a particular challenge relative to it. In some ways, this book is in many ways a product of the fact that I was a graduate student at Stanford in the late 90s. So I was at Stanford, I started in 1996, right as the dot-com boom was starting, and ended and finished my degree right as the first iteration of the dot-com boom was kind of like collapsing for the first time. And so a lot of the sort of like questions that I'm asking about in this in some ways come from the predicament of being an arts graduate student at an institution that is really, really deeply and profoundly sort of like the heart of a lot of the technocratic revolutions that I'm trying to talk about. Berkeley, I think, has a slightly different relationship to it, though, right? Like Berkeley's relationship to it, I think, both is complicated by the fact as a public institution and the question of what we do to try to shore up public support for education in lots of different realms, not just in this sort of like tech training or jobs training world, and talk about what the value of education is within the public education world in a way that is very different from the kinds of dilemmas or the kind of situation that Stanford is in around that. I think the other thing that's complicated for Berkeley is the fact that on some level, we are one of, and maybe the preeminent Cold War higher education institution in the United States, right? Like a lot of the research excellence of Berkeley is really founded on the kind of work that was done around the Cold War and the nuclear projects of Los Alamos and so forth, and the Lawrence Berkeley labs and things like that. And to some extent, the reputation for research excellence that the university still enjoys is very much based on that foundation, and is about trying to hold on to that sort of like foundation for that world. And so the question is like whether or not the kinds of reputation that Berkeley also has for things like social change and social justice and things like that, which are emerging right after that in the 60s, can still survive if we are trying as an institution to hold on to the kind of like technological ideas about innovativeness at the forefront of what it is that we're doing. And that feels like a real challenge for us, partly because some of the things that are enabled by those technological shifts are actually very much to the detriment of social justice.
Other questions? Yes. You're about to get a mic.
I'm just wondering, you alluded to the role of like the individual as a creator, but you know, some people, including me, look at creativity as a, collaborative or network.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm just wondering, because not only is, invention or creativity nationalized, but it's also, this thing about the lone inventor, in the US, we have the patent system that reinforced it. So I'm just wondering if that plays a role in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. It does for sure in the sort of like epilogue of the book where I talk about the ways that we might need to reframe creativity. So one of the things that I talk about is how we need to really start talking about it as a social process, and not just as the preeminent form of individual expression, that actually those ideas about it as the preeminent form of individual expression are one of the things that have made it so easy to hijack, or not even to hijack, that have made it so closely aligned to neoliberalism in a lot of ways, and have helped to shore up support for neoliberalism. And so trying to rethink about it as a social process is actually one of the really important kind of shifts that I think we need to make about it. The other one that I think we need to make about it is to stop thinking about it as, or to stop emphasizing models of creativity that are really invested in product and output, and to think about it really as a set of processes that are kind of never ending, right? Like the product that's created is just one moment in a long chain of activities that have a much broader open-endedness, a much more broadly open-ended set of conditions or dynamics that I think are really what we want to be focusing on, especially as we teach it to other people.
Does that also require any kind of structural rethinking of intellectual property? I mean, your question raises that, and Shannon, your book talks about the idea that largely what the United States exports in the last 40 years is IP. Is IP. So is that? I mean, is it not just a rhetorical problem? Is it also in some ways a legal problem?
I think it's a value problem in some ways. I mean, one of the things that I kind of talk about in that last section as well is that one of the things that arts education I think needs to be doing is to rethinking about, is to really use the arts to think about ethical exploration for all kinds of things. And that one of the reasons that's important is because it would force a sort of attention onto what are the things that we think are ethically important and why. How would that allow us to focus our attention away from just a sort of like market effect of creativity to one that's thinking about ethical impact of creative activity. But the third would be, I think, to try to move us off of just thinking about creativity in its monetizable iterations, which I think would also be something that's.
But the us in that sentence is scholars and critics.
Well, I think that's the world that we have influence over, right? Right. We can't really like influence what's happening. Well, I don't know. To the extent that one of the things that we do is also train the next generation of like tech employees, it feels like in education we would have an important role in trying to like shift their ways of thinking about this too.
Sarah. So, do you want to?
Right. I'm taking a microphone first. Shannon, I was wondering if there's a gender element to this story. If creativity in its artisanal iteration, in its manual labor iteration, in its contemporary iteration is gendered in any kind of way?
Yes and no. It certainly is in things like the maker world. Actually, one of the reasons that the maker world starts to bring in all of these activities that we think of as sort of like domestic crafting, like knitting or crocheting or jewelry making or things like that. And those all become sort of like placed under the umbrella of making alongside all of the sort of like high-tech atelier things around like microprocessing and things like that, is because the people who are running the publishing side of the make world realize that they have no women readers and that there are no women involved in it. And so one of the things that they do is to then like try to expand the number of activities that fall under the maker umbrella in order to bring women into that world. One of the things that I think is the kind of unintentional impact of that, but that has nevertheless been really important for the knock-on effects of things like how we think about making, is the way that it's also that crafting world has also been really important for thinking about the work of making as leisure and not as work. So one of the things that's kind of interesting in that world is they talk about all of the instructional manuals or the books or things like that for making as cookbooks. Which I think is a really interesting kind of like historical analog, because if you think about how cookbooks came into the world, cookbooks emerge in the publishing market as a way to convince middle-class women that cooking is a leisure activity and not a labor activity. At the same time, the domestic workers are kind of like disappearing from the labor market because it becomes more expensive to hire them. And so one of the things that I think that kind of metaphor is also doing inside of the maker world is that it's trying to convince people that labor is actually a form of leisured activity, which then is sort of like interesting if you think about that situation with like maker spaces being imported into China and into the manufacturing economies of China and things like that. So
Yeah, I actually think that's a really fascinating question because one side is what you just said, the sort of attempt to use creativity to bring in under its umbrella activities associated with unwaged female labor or with female leisure activities. But you could see the other side as an actual try to reclaim for men and for masculinity aspects of that work that otherwise might have been thought of as craft. I say this because I happened to read this book alongside another seemingly unrelated book, which is a history of crossword puzzles. It's half anorexia memoir and half sort of feminist history of crossword puzzles, which points out that in addition to the connection between those two subjects, it points, women were the constructors, though they weren't called constructors, of crossword puzzles for much of its history, and then in basically the last third of the 20th century, which it gets completely masculinized and associated with forms of problem solving that I do think have some kinship to the world of creativity. And now it's like a huge struggle for all these major media companies in an age where things like crossword puzzles basically fund institutions like the New York Times to bring in women puzzle constructors, because it's like computers that were also originally women's work when it was seen as clerical. Suddenly it becomes seen as requiring a certain kind of mental labor that's coded as masculine. So there is a weird sort of other side of the answer that this book gives to Sarah's question. That's interesting. Sorry, yeah, Kathy.
Just want to offer an example that seems to be more relevant than Apple. A Cold War company that completely has appropriated the concept of creativity into not just to the ideas about it, but also to the spaceness of it. And that's Disneyland and Disney World and all that. Because I'm doing this course, learning from Disney for the college, as you know. And it's like a kind of quintessential version of the successful selling of the idea of creativity. The animator strikes all the way through everything going on now. It is one of the kind of cruelest companies you could ever imagine, with the happiest face. So just a note. Thank you. I'm going to assign this book.
The mentality of like both the sort of the creative face, but then the lock on the work that people are actually doing is one of the things that Silicon Valley has totally sort of like structurally imported from places like Disney, and that they referred back to, or that Disney actually refers back to. So at one point, Disney had a movie that they ran out of the California Adventures Park that was supposed to be a movie about California. It's called like California Dreaming or something like that. Yes. That's right, Golden Dreams. And it ended with Mike Eisner giving this speech at the end, talking about from the silver screen to the computer screen as being the story of California. So they're like very much thinking about the connection between those two things.
So I have to ask a question. I mean, why isn't the conclusion to this book and to this discussion just abandoning the term? Why not like having shown both its complicated and coded history, and in some ways it's intellectual incoherence, I think. Also, we didn't talk about that, but there's an undertow of that in this book. Why not just jettison the thing? It's damaging, and it's intellectually lazy, and it's no longer helping the causes. Or
I certainly thought of ending the book that way, just letting the sort of things that I talk about as the sort of case studies or the sort of like the illustrative examples of it speak towards that end. And I didn't for two reasons. And one of them is the fact of how powerful this term is. And it does feel like, okay, so we can just let this term have its energy, and I don't know, maybe it'll just play itself out and burn itself out. And that's certainly one possibility. But it does feel like it still has so much purchase especially in the educational world, that I felt like actually taking a moment to talk about how we really need to redefine it inside of education and sort of like thinking about that with my dean's hat on feels important to me.
Right. So rather than divest from it, you want to either reclaim it or maybe just stay in the conversation and as a critical voice.
I think both, but also to like actively reshape it, not just reclaim it, like not just take it back and sort of saying, look, this is a term for the arts, and so this is what the art
Right.
really, the arts are the people who are right about this, but that to actually try to like keep talking to other people who are using it and saying, look, we need to be like shifting this stuff this way, and this is why. So part of it is just to not abandon that conversation, given how important that term is, especially in education. But the other reason is that I really do think that the arts has some work to do around thinking about this in its own right. Like those arguments about things like the art, creativity is the foremost form of individual expression has been a problem in the arts too, partly because it has, I think, served as a shield against some of the criticism of work that happens in the arts and the kinds of representational effects of it, where sometimes, First Amendment arguments or arguments about personal expression are used to, say, defend a work of art that is being criticized for being racist or something like that, right? So I think that artists need to think about things like the ethical implications of their work as well. And if we just abandon it to a form of personal expression, then that has its own sort of problematic implications that really need to be thought about.
Great. Well, I'll ask you to join me in thanking Shannon. And the book's in paperback. You can find it at your local bookstore or bookshop.org, and please enjoy it.